What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining us. Today we are speaking about the most hated 3 Series BMW I think that there is, and I've heard a lot of trash talk about this car and why it is so bad. So I'm going to speak about that, and what makes it so bad actually makes it that good. Stay with us. Alright, so I'm back, but I'm back with a slightly different episode this week, and we're in a bit of a transitional phase with the BMW and the Ford and everything that's going on. We'll get to that a bit later, but I thought I would release this video just to kind of explain what the perception is about certain cars, this one in particular, and what can actually be achieved and what is available to us these days as we move forward with technology and the times. Let's talk a bit about the BMW E90. Now, the BMW E90 was on sale from 2005 up until 2011. 320i was sold in South Africa. Now, there were other models also sold around the world, I think a 316 and a 318. I'm speaking specifically about the 4 cylinders because that is what we're dealing with today. They obviously made other variations, the 325, the 323, 330, 335, and obviously the M3, but we're not focusing on those for now. We're focusing on the 320, and why is it the most hated 3 Series of all time? Now, in its production run, its direct competitors were the Audi A4 2-liter, that is a naturally aspirated version. Audi also had a 1.8 turbo and a 2-liter turbo, but they were not in the same class as this 320. Mercedes-Benz had the W204 C180, but that was a turbocharged 1.8 liter engine Merc, so we can't really compare it because the 320i was specifically NA. The E90 was a bit of a transitional period in BMW's history. They were going from the normally aspirated route to the turbo route, which was the future. Now, at the same time, most of Europe was being dominated by the diesel craziness and frenzy that was all around Europe, and it's also at the same time the Volkswagen Audi group had the Golf 5 GTI, which was making 200 horsepower. When this BMW was out, its engine, the N46 B20, this specific one, was only making 148 horsepower, and that is its biggest challenge with this car. It's highly regarded as an asthmatic 4-cylinder 2-liter motor, but it doesn't mean that the engine itself is necessarily, it was just not the right fit for the chassis in terms of a performance vehicle, and it did the job. It was a good entry-level car, but as the car aged and the chassis aged, the engine didn't really age well with it, and that gets us into why it is so hated. Alright, so I'm just going to go into the suspension technology in this car. Now, I have to read it, I can't remember all the terminology, but basically up front it had McPherson struts with an aluminium hub carrier and aluminium dual lower links forming a virtual pivot point on the front suspension, and the rear suspension had a 5-link multi-link suspension with fabricated steel subframe, fabricated steel control arm, and cast iron carrier. This design was designated the HA5 by BMW. So now we jump into why it was so hated. Now, I spoke a bit about that before. It is the N46 B20 engine. Now, BMW's predecessor to this was the M44. They didn't really have a motor that kind of jumped in between because the M44 was around when the M52 series 6 cylinders were out, and the successor to the M52 6 cylinders was the M54, which came out in the E46 vehicles, and that was a similar design to the M52, which was in the E36, but just an upgraded version. It had Vanos, dual Vanos, and but they didn't make like an M54 4-cylinder version which had dual Vanos. They jumped straight from the M44, which is what I have in my E36, the highly tuned version, to the N46. motors. And now you get a couple of variations of this, but this which came out in the E46, the N46 series, they had variable valve timing, double Vanos with Valvetronic, which is variable lift. Now there was a version of this that didn't have the Valvetronic, I forget the designation of that engine, but it made less power. So this engine, before the E36 project, I had a E46 318 Ti that I was originally going to turn into a race car, but decided against it after discussions with a lot of people in the BMW circles. The reason being is the South African climate is extremely hot and dry depending on where you are in South Africa. If you're up further north inland where we are, Pretoria, Johannesburg, close to Kyalami, we had altitude 1500 meters above sea level, and it is in summer it gets very hot, 35 degrees, 40 degrees Celsius sometimes, and it's a very dry climate as well in winter. So the challenges that engine faces over time are the timing chain guide. Specifically, it gets over time from the heat cycles, it just cracks and perishes, and that's what happened in that E46 318 Ti. And a lot of the engine seals just die. Rear main seal, front seal, Vanos seals, crank seal, the Vanos actuators, so many different seals, the valve cover gasket, the Valvetronic seal, the intake manifold, little O-rings, they perish. So many little things, and it's because of these heat cycles that it just can't deal with it. As well as the fact that the engine has some significant problems with it. The valve stem seals also die a slow death, and so when the vehicle gets up to like 160, 180,000 kilometers, those seals start going hot, and then it starts leaking oil down the valve stem, and effectively you start burning oil. So a lot of these small challenges of the engine faces a lot of these small challenges. The other problem is it only makes 148 horsepower. So now there was a 320SI brought out, which was a homologation vehicle for the World Touring Car Series, and this was quite a trick E90. It was very, very pretty. It had basically a BMW M Sport kit on it, fancy BMW Motorsport wheels, carbon fiber valve cover, and they got rid of the Valvetronic system. I think they still kept the Vanos, not sure, but power went up from 148 horsepower, it's 110 kilowatts, up to 170 horsepower. So that was a significant jump. However, in comparison, at the same time, Honda had its Type R out, the normally aspirated, now the legendary K series, and that was making 200 horsepower. At the same time, there was the Clio RS, still the normally aspirated version, that was also making 195 horsepower. So in comparison, it wasn't very good. And like I say, at the same time, the Golf 5 GTR was out. That was making 147 kilowatts. That's 200 horsepower plus, plus the torque and the DSG box. So really, it was underpowered for what it was supposed to be. And then you combine that with the weight of the vehicle, and it really was not at all a performance car. And as the car has aged, the engine has aged significantly. With all those challenges I spoke about, and so to maintain it, get it back on the road, it's not worth it. It's much more worth it to buy a 325i or something like that, that's worth the drive, you've got the extra torque and power, and then it's worth maintaining it. So these cars, a lot of them are, especially in Africa, they kind of driven into the ground and then left for dead, really, because it's so expensive to maintain them. A few of our suppliers in South Africa actually started selling brand new BMW engines from BMW for really good prices. So in other words, the time of that TI engine, I remember seeing a new engine on sale from one of our local suppliers, a big supplier, parts shop, for 50,000 Rand. And you might think, okay, 50,000 Rand, that's a lot of money. But if you had to try and rebuild that engine, we're talking piston rings, bearings, whatever, machine work, head, gasket sets, all of that stuff. It's a no-brainer. You're getting a brand new engine for that money. But again, that kind of money, the car, that was more than a third of the value of the car. So it didn't make sense, basically. So a lot of those chassis have kind of become redundant and been stripped for parts cars, and the ones that are left they've either been well maintained and then they're still driven around, or they are kind of just driven into the ground and now being sold. A lot of them are being sold on marketplace. One of the other issues is that the Valvetronic motor eventually dies, and then you need to replace the motor, the coil packs, the wiring. There were a lot of small challenges with these cars. So let's get to the bit that we are after. What makes it so good? Well, we'll start with the first one, and I touched on this a bit earlier about where they are now. A lot of these cars have been driven into the ground, and they're selling on Facebook Marketplace. Now, I've done some digging and I found some of these cars on sale for 30 grand. That's 30,000 Rand. That is about, 1,500 US. So that is pretty incredible. That's a very low price for essentially a new chassis vehicle. And why is that significant? Because if you look at this table that I've got up here, we look at essentially we're looking at the E90 versus the E30 versus the E36. And if you look at the wheelbase, you're talking about a car that is now longer in its wheelbase. The E30 was 2.5 meters, E36 was 2.7, but the E90 is 2.760. Why is that important? Because a longer wheelbase car makes the car more stable at higher speeds. You're also talking about better suspension geometry, better design, newer design materials in terms of the chassis and the shell, in terms of the way the shell flexes, in terms of the pickup points, like I say, the geometry. The width of the car, the E30 was 1645 millimeters. The E36 was 1698, but the E90 is 1.8 meters, 1817 millimeters. Again, that increases the footprint of the car and gives it more stability. So a good chassis just to start off with. The height is a little higher. For sure, the E30 was 1380, E36 1393. The E90 is 1421 in terms of its height. The front axle. So now for the E36, the E30, I couldn't find front axle and rear axle measurements. So this is basically where the track width. So I'm using the M3 and just took a couple of numbers off. So the E30 was 1400 plus minus, E36 1407, E90 1500, 1.5 meters wide on the front axle. Rear axle 1420 on the E30, 1415 on the E36, but 1513 on the rear axle. Now that's going to be good for higher power cars. And the big one, one of the most important metrics, the coefficient of drag. Now that is a number that is used to measure how draggy the car is in terms of its aerodynamics. So if you're pulling something through the air, if you're driving down the highway, whatever it is, that is how much wind resistance in terms of a factor the car is going to have, how much it's holding itself back. So the higher the number, the more drag it has. So the E30 had a coefficient of drag number of 0.36 in its day. The E36 had a coefficient of drag of 0.31. The E90 has a coefficient of drag of 0.28. And that is significantly better than the E36 and the E30, especially for higher speeds. It's going to accelerate better. It's going to basically be a lot more stable also at high speeds, given the track width, the wheelbase, and the coefficient of drag. So you're starting with a very good package. The next thing to note is the weight. So obviously the E30 is a very light chassis, but it is a very old chassis, and so you're talking about a weight of 1130 kilograms versus the E36, which was about 1440. If you look at my E36 build, it's around that. That's where we were when we started with this, with that build, and it had fuel in it, so it makes sense. That car was also about 1446 or something. And then the E90 1435 kilograms. So again, that's a 320. Coming back to it, you're dealing with a car that's in the ballpark of the weight and in the ball, but much better coefficient of drag, much wider, much longer chassis to start off with. A really good starter pack for a build. Now, if you look at the buy-in number, 30 grand South African, that's 1500 US. Now in the US, obviously in your country, you'll have to see what they value, what they out there for, but I'm like, where we are in South Africa, this makes a lot of sense. Oh, it's really cheap as a starting point for a project car, considering everything. Now this, I must also say that this video is specifically aimed for the enthusiast. So if you are someone that wants to buy a car and not do anything specifically to it, like big changes and whatever, this video is not really going to be for you, because this is focused on someone that is going to look to really make big changes, but have a stable platform, a good platform to start with. So if you're watching this video, I would then say get the E90 330, and that's a good package. It's a good starting point. There are a couple of guys that race them with us in the BMW series. They have had to do a lot to the chassis. We'll get into that now, but they're a good car. It's a great package. Turbo K24, you make good torque and power on a Turbo K24. It'll sit pretty far in the engine bay, pretty far back. You'll have to figure out there are kits out there that you can bolt where you can bolt the K24 to a BMW gearbox. Those are options. So there are lots of options. There's other turbo options, you know, the turbo 6 cylinders. There are V8 options. You know, really in terms of performance, the sky's the limit. But my recommendation would be stick to the basics. M54 B30 is a real good platform. You could even go an M3 engine, you know, find an S50 B32 if you want to, or whatever you want to do. But my recommendation is the M54 B30. Good platform, supercharged, turbocharged, NA, brilliant. What are going to be the challenges with this kind of upgrade? Well, there's going to be a few. Like any challenges facing a stock car going to a track car, you're going to be faced with suspension options. You're going to be faced with bushes, ball joints. How do you figure that out? Braking system upgrades. What are you going to do there? But one of the bigger challenges you're going to be faced with is the weight. So although the car weighs 1435 kilograms, and it's very similar to an E36 stock weight, getting weight out of the car is not as easy as getting weight out of the car of an E36. The reason being is because it's a newer design, so a lot of the metals and philosophies and components used in the chassis are obviously better, stronger, but heavier. Like in an E36, we managed to get my car down to you know, 1190 or 1180 kilograms. With the 6-cylinder, you might not find that same gain in an E90, just because of the components, etc., that are still quite heavy. So you'll have to do a lot of scratching, polycarb windows, etc., you know, a lot of gutting of the unnecessary components, but you will still be able to get a lot of weight out of it, and it will still be a good package going forward. Another thing I've heard people speak about is this multi-link rear suspension, this 5-link suspension, getting it to behave in race conditions. Now I've heard two sides of this story. I've heard it's extremely stable, and then I've heard it does what it wants, toe in, toe out, this, that, and the next thing. I'm not really sure, but I've seen quite a few of these cars being raced, so it's definitely possible. There's lots of kits out there, and there's lots of information out there, so It's not impossible, it's just going to take a bit of effort, that's all. It's like most things when developing a car. So the question you need to ask yourself, is it still worth it? Well, I think it is, because if your buy-in price is cheap enough, and if you're going to do the upgrade anyway, like so if you buy an E36 and you're going to go for the M54B30 anyway, the 3-litre E46 engine, you're going to do these things anyway, you're going to get to similar price points. However, with the E90 chassis, you're going to be a lot further ahead in terms of chassis, wheelbase, drag, stability. So in the end, you'll actually have a better package. And we're not talking aero, I'm talking aeroless cars, like you know, just a stock production looking car, super touring type look. So in other words, no aero on the car. I think it is still worth it. If you can get if the buy-in price is right, it's definitely still worth it. And remember, when you strip the car, you can still sell the seats, the airbags, you can sell the ECU, engine, drivetrain, all of these little things to try and recoup some money. You just got to have time and patience and list the stuff correctly, but you'll recoup money. Whereas on the older cars, especially an E30, you're not going to get the value out of those components. They're just not there. As a buying point, as a newer design chassis, stronger, more stable, I think it is a really good platform for a performance vehicle. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think? Do you think it's worth it? Do you think maybe it's worth sticking with the E36, you know? But if you want, me personally, if you want a newer looking car for not a lot of money, better, stronger, perhaps better handling chassis without massive complications, it's definitely an option. So let me know what you guys think. Thanks for joining me on this journey. I might have a couple of E90 projects planned for the future. In fact, I do. I've got one plan in my head. We just need budget, time and effort, and I'm very excited about that. I also have an F30 project planned. Again, it's budget, time, how we're going to make it happen, but I'm super excited about the F30 one. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching. It was a bit of a different episode, but I hope you enjoyed it and saw where we can go with what we have on the 320. Anyway, coming up next is going to be a bit of a status of where we are. That'll kind of be the last episode for 2024. Thank you everybody for supporting me this year, and I'm very excited for 25. It's going to be some different changes, but we are going to keep pushing forward with the E36 and that touring car build, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one. Ciao. Bye.